The cold blue lights of the xenobiology lab flickered as a group of alien students gathered around the main specimen table, their instructor a tall six-eyed being named. Professor Keln spoke in rhythmic pulses translated into soft humming through the cum chips. The subject of the day was symbiotic neural responses, but none of that would matter soon because disaster was about to erupt. Without warning, a loud snap echoed through the lab, followed by a violent hiss and a burst of acidic steam. A container of volatile compounds had fallen from one of the upper racks. Colliding with the heating coils below, a chain reaction began, and in seconds, a small explosion rocked the room, throwing students backward and shattering instruments' glass. Shards flew, and the thick, sour smell of burning flesh filled the air. One alien, a green-scaled student named Thrin, had taken the full force of the blast. His lower limbs twisted unnaturally, his breathing ragged, his mouth dripping violet blood. He lay motionless, twitching, while the others screamed in panic and scattered. One student did not run, instead the only human in the class. A broad-shouldered young man named Jace vaulted over the debris and slid next to Thrin with movements sharp and deliberate. Jace tore off his academy jacket and knelt beside the alien, checking his pulse, which was fading fast. The other students stared, frozen, unsure of what to do. None of them had training for something like this, and the medbots had not yet arrived. They all assumed the only proper response was to wait for emergency drones. But Jace thought differently. He had no time to waste. His hands worked fast, and with strange purpose. He pulled a belt from his pants, looped it under one of Thrin's snapped limbs, and began tightening it. The alien screamed in agony, and the others gasped in horror, not understanding what the human was doing. They begged him to stop, but Jace ignored them, his eyes locked on the injured alien with a focus born of countless hours studying Earth's emergency survival protocols. He reached into his pack, grabbed a small bottle of antiseptic alcohol, and poured it over the wound. The skin sizzled, the blood steamed. Thrin moaned but remained conscious. Just then, found a shard of metal lying nearby and placed it against a power core to heat it. It glowed red, and without hesitation, he pressed it against an open artery, sealing it with crude but effective heat. The alien students turned away, some wretched, unable to handle the sight. Vera, a pale blue student with delicate limbs, crouched behind a table, shaking as she peeked at the scene, eyes wide with both fear and awe. She had never seen anyone act so fast, so fearlessly, so brutally effective. The door finally burst open, and medical drones hovered in the room, scanning injuries and firing tranquilizers to calm those in shock. When they reached Thrin, they paused. The damage was extensive, but somehow he was still alive and stabilized. The lead drone buzzed confusion, its voice flat, as it asked who performed the field intervention. Jace stood and raised his hand, streaks of blood across his face and arms. The room fell silent, every alien eye focused on him, their expressions a mix of horror, confusion, and strange curiosity. Professor Keln stepped forward, his tone heavy and displeased. He questioned Jace, asking why he had interfered, why he had used unsanctioned methods on a classmate. Jace simply replied he did what he had to do, or the student would have died. He explained he had seen worse on Earth, that waiting was not always an option, and that pain was sometimes necessary to survive. Keln looked at him for a long moment, then turned away, not offering praise, not scolding, just silent thought. Later in the medbay, Thrin was placed in regeneration fluid, his vitals recovering slowly. The drones confirmed that Jace's actions, though unorthodox, had prevented massive blood loss and nerve damage. The alien students gathered in hushed groups, whispering about what they had witnessed. The humans' methods were barbaric, they said, but also effective. Some admitted they might have died if they had been in Thrin's place. Others said they would rather die than go through what Jace had done. Vera remained quiet, her mind replaying every moment, the fire in Jace's eyes, the strength in his arms, the steadiness of his hands. She had felt useless, frozen, afraid. She wanted to understand how someone from such a violent world could stay calm while everyone else fell apart. She watched Jace as he sat outside the medbay alone, his clothes still stained, his face blank and unreadable. Academy would soon start an investigation, but for now one truth was undeniable: Thrin was alive. Because of Jace, and every alien in that room knew it, the human had done something they never expected. He had shown them that sometimes survival did not come from perfection or technology. It came from courage, instinct, and the willingness to act. When no one else could move, and this was only the beginning, whispers spread through the corridors of the academy. Like wildfire, every student, every instructor, even the maintenance bots seemed to be murmuring about what the human had done in the lab the day before. Alien students passed Jace with wide eyes, some filled with fear, others with curiosity. A few stepped back as if being near him might somehow bring pain or violence. But Jace kept walking quietly, carrying his books like nothing had happened. His clothes were clean, now his wounds from the blast treated, but the memory of his actions still hung heavy in the air. In the lecture chamber, the air was thick with tension. The moment Jace entered the room, silence fell. Every seat was filled, every student watching him as he took his place in the back row. Professor Keln entered, not humming as usual, but speaking in direct words, a rare and serious tone. Today, he said, they would not follow the original syllabus today. They would review and discuss the unauthorized first aid performed by Cadet Jace. The room stirred. The professor gestured, and a large hologram displayed recordings from the incident, captured by lab security drones, footage of Jace resetting the bone, pouring alcohol, cauterizing the wound. It all played in graphic detail. Many students turned away, some clutched their stomachs. One even ran out, but others leaned in, watching every second. With growing interest, Vera sat in the front, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes locked on the screen, not blinking. She had replayed the moment 100 times in her mind, but seeing it again made her chest tighten. She remembered the fear, the smell, the screams, and then the calm way Jace had worked through it all. When the footage ended, Professor Keln faced the class and asked the question that echoed in many minds. Was it right to act without permission, to use pain and risk to save a life? Or should Jace have waited for official help? Should he be punished for violating protocols or praised for saving someone? No one spoke at first. Then a tall, violet-scaled student named Drax stood and said humans were dangerous, that their instincts were too violent, that Jace had endangered everyone. Others nodded, agreeing that pain should never be the first choice, that medical care must be controlled, safe, and precise. Then Vera stood, her voice soft but firm. She said she had seen Thrin bleeding, unable to breathe, and none of them had moved. None had helped except Jace. She said she had never seen courage like that, and that if she were ever hurt, she would want someone like Jace near her, not someone who waited for a bot. She did not defend the pain, but she defended the choice. The room fell into thoughtful silence as Keln nodded and dismissed the class for a break outside. In the courtyard, Vera approached Jace. He sat under a low metal tree, flipping through an old human survival manual. His eyes looked tired but calm. She sat beside him for a moment. They said nothing. Then she asked him how he had learned to do what he did. He smiled and said, Earth was not a kind place, that if you waited too long someone died. He told her stories of his mountain rescue training, desert survival missions, and war zone medics who stitched wounds with fishing lines and kept hearts beating with bare hands. He said, Earth trained its people not because they wanted pain, but because they had to survive without guarantees. Vera listened quietly, absorbing every word, her fear of him slowly replaced by something deeper, respect, maybe even envy. She confessed she had always been afraid of pain, that her people taught avoidance and numbness as the best path, but now she wondered if that made them weak, if comfort had stolen their strength. She asked Jace if he would teach her not just the techniques, but the mindset, the will to move when others freeze. He looked at her surprised, then nodded once without a word. The next day, they met in a small unused storage room turned training chamber. Jace brought strange objects, cloths, bottles, rods, and straps. He told her they would simulate wounds and train her to act under pressure. He began with simple things, wrapping limbs, applying pressure, cleaning artificial cuts. Vera trembled at first, her hands shaking, her breath shallow, but she forced herself to continue even when her skin stung from the antiseptic, even when her mind screamed to stop. She pushed forward. Meanwhile, the academy staff watched from above, metaphorically and literally. An older alien administrator named Sareth had been reviewing the footage and student reports. He saw danger in Jace, not just because of what he did, but because of what he represented: a different way of thinking, one that challenged order and control. Sareth filed a formal report to the Galactic Ethics Board, stating that the human cadet had performed high-risk, unauthorized procedures, encouraged unsafe behavior, and was spreading dangerous methods among students. He requested immediate review and possible expulsion. The Academy Board scheduled a hearing but kept it quiet for now while Jace trained Vera, and while the rest of the students remained divided. Some saw him as a reckless brute, others as a brave pioneer. The lines had been drawn, but no one yet knew the true test was coming soon, a test that would not be theoretical or simulated, but real and deadly. And in that moment, only one kind of knowledge would matter, not the kind written in books, but the kind written in scars. Training continued each day after classes ended. Vera would meet Jace in the quiet storage room that smelled of old circuit boards and metallic dust. At first, her movements were slow, hesitant. Her eyes flicked nervously at every object. He introduced every strap, every tool, every synthetic wound pad. Her hands trembled and sweat dripped down her neck, but she never turned away. Not once. Jace saw something in her that reminded him of young recruits on Earth, those who had never seen pain up close, but wanted to be ready when it finally came. Cameus showed her how to build a makeshift stretcher from scrap tubing and worn cloth, how to clean a wound with boiling water when medicine ran out, how to tell the difference between a dying breath and one clinging to life. They practiced bandaging while blindfolded, applying pressure while music blared, and even simulating the screams of pain from a speaker to break her focus. But still she moved forward, failing sometimes, but rising again, stronger each time. What surprised him most was that she began asking questions, deeper ones, not just how but why. What made humans endure when logic said give up? He told her about the freezing peaks where climbers lost fingers, but still helped strangers reach safety, about battlefield nurses who crawled through gunfire to keep a heart beating with bare hands. He spoke of mothers lifting cars to save their children, of miners trapped for days, singing through pain to stay sane. Vera listened with wide eyes and a silence that held reverence. Every story reshaped her mind, carved out old fears, and filled them with something new, something sharp and bright, and almost dangerous. Meanwhile, around the academy, the tension thickened. Students who once ignored Jace now whispered about him openly, some calling him a savage, others calling him the only one who knew what real life meant. Even Professor Keln, who had kept his distance, began attending his lectures with more focus, watching him like a puzzle he could not solve. One morning, Keln asked Vera to stay after class and questioned her about her sessions with Jace. She expected scolding, but instead he simply asked what she had learned. Her answer was simple. She said she learned to stop freezing when it mattered most. Elsewhere in the administrative dome, the ethics board received the full report from Sareth, including footage, written statements, and analysis from psychological monitors. They studied the data without expression, noting how Jace's influence had shifted not only behavior but belief. They debated whether to act swiftly or observe longer, whether to contain the human or allow the experiment to unfold. One younger member asked a single question that silenced a room: what happens if the others start thinking like him back? In the training room, Jace created a mock disaster zone using debris, broken lights, heat lamps, and low oxygen. He told Vera she had 3 minutes to find and treat 3 wounded dummies, each with different simulated injuries. He gave no hints and no comfort, just a nod to begin. She hesitated only once, then moved fast, crawling over wreckage, flipping broken chairs, checking pulses, and applying wraps and splints with methodical hands. Her lungs burned, her muscles ached, but she completed it in 2 minutes 52 seconds. When she turned to Jace, he did not smile, but his eyes softened. Later that evening, while walking the corridor lit with the gentle purple hue of night cycle lamps, Vera asked Jace why he never seemed afraid, why his hands never shook, why he never looked back. He paused for a long time before answering. He said he was always afraid that every time he stepped into a wound or pressed heat against an artery or heard Someone screamed. He felt a storm inside, but he acted anyway because on Earth fear was normal. Waiting was deadly and doing nothing was not an option. That night Vera could not sleep, her thoughts a whirlwind. She remembered the first moment she saw blood. The helplessness she felt, the shame of standing frozen while Thrin nearly died. Now when she looked in the mirror she saw something else, not a fragile student, but a survivor in the making. Her skin still pale, her eyes still wide, but her spine straighter, her breath steadier. She was becoming something more, and it terrified her in the best way. The next day, the academy made an announcement. A field excursion was scheduled to the glacier moon of Severin, a place known for its extreme terrain and rare ice flora. Several students from the xenobiology program, including Jace and Vera, were selected. The trip would include shuttle transport, environmental study, and emergency procedure drills, all under the watch of academy instructors. Vera felt a thrill of both excitement and dread. She sensed this was more than a learning trip. This was a test of something bigger, something she had only just begun to understand. Jace said nothing when the announcement came. He simply packed his gear, triple-checked his first aid kit, and looked at the icy moon on the holomap. With quiet calculation, Vera noticed how he moved slower that evening, not from doubt, but from awareness, as if he knew something she did not, as if he felt the shadow of what was coming before it arrived. And though he said nothing, she followed him without question, because now she trusted him more than any system. More than the shuttle lifted into the black sky, leaving the academy towers behind as stars shimmered across the glass dome. The glacier moon of Severin came into view, a swirling white sphere carved with mountain ridges and frozen valleys. The temperature readings blinked warnings, cold beyond tolerance, with winds sharp enough to slice thin metal. Suits had been upgraded, oxygen levels checked, emergency drills reviewed, but even the instructors carried unease in their silence. Jace sat at the rear seat, his eyes fixed on the screen. Vera sat beside him, fingers pressed together, her breath shallow but steady. Other students chatted nervously, excited about the adventure, but Jace watched their faces, calculating who would freeze, who would panic, who might surprise him. The shuttle landed with a soft thud, and the hatch opened. A rush of bitter air slapped them hard, even through their insulated suits. They stepped out onto hard ice, ground crunched. With every step, winds howled across the plain, visibility thin white mist curling around distant jagged rocks. Their guide, a gray-skinned instructor named Velok, gave a signal, and the group began hiking toward the research station, 3 kilometers away over unstable terrain. The first hour passed without trouble. Students gathered samples, scraped ice for flora readings, documented frost growth on exposed surfaces. Vera worked quietly beside Jace, noting patterns, copying procedures, but always keeping her eyes alert. Just like he had taught her, clouds shifted, and a strange vibration passed under their feet, just a tremble, then another. Velok raised a hand, warning everyone to stop, but the ground beneath them gave way in a sudden roar of breaking ice, and several students, including Vera, slid down into a hidden crevice. Jace dove after them without pause, his rope catching a jagged edge as he disappeared below. The fall was not deep, but rough, sharp edges tore through gear. One student landed with a scream, a twisted leg, bones clearly fractured. Vera landed hard, her side bruised, her vision blurred, but she forced herself up, checking the others. Jace landed last, rolling to absorb impact, then rising with urgency, he moved to the injured student at once, checking pulse, controlling bleeding, using strips from his own jacket to bind the leg. The cold bit into their skin. Their breath fogged fast, but he moved like time was chasing him. Vera crawled over to assist, her fingers shaking as she unzipped the emergency pack, pulling out the sealant wrap. Jace nodded once, not speaking. Both of them knew speaking wasted air, and they had little of it. He pointed to another student with signs of internal trauma, shallow breath, bluish skin. They had to act fast or lose them. Vera took over monitoring pulse while Jace improvised a heat pad using battery cells and insulation foam. His hands burned, but he wrapped the injured tightly, sealing warmth where machines had failed above. The others had already called for help, but the storm system rolling in made communications flicker. Rescue could take hours, and temperatures were falling. The crevice was narrow walls thick with frost, and every breath stung deeper. Vera wrapped her scarf around the weakest student, whispering to keep her awake, while Jace fashioned a stretcher from poles and suit fibers. He tested the strength, pulling hard enough to snap metal, but it held. Barely. Time passed slow, like melting ice. Their fingers stiffened. Their lips cracked, but they moved without rest. Jace looked at Vera, then at the injured, then at the slope above. It was too steep for them to climb with the wounded, unless they found an anchor point. He drove his ice pick into the wall, tying his rope, slowly pulling himself upward, inch by inch, until he reached a small ledge. From there, he began pulling one student at a time, with Vera pushing from below. She slipped once, cutting her arm, but ignored the pain, wiping blood on her suit and continuing without flinch. When the last student reached the top, Jace lowered the stretcher, Vera secured it, and together they hauled the injured up. Every pull, a struggle, every movement, a test of will. The rescue team arrived just as they reached the surface, blinking in disbelief at the scene. The students alive but battered, the human and the soft-voiced alien girl standing amid blood, frost, and torn suits, holding up the others like pillars of some ancient myth. Velok stared at them in silence, then turned away, his voice breaking as he ordered the team back to the shuttle. Inside the shuttle, warmth returned slowly. One medic scanned Vera's wounds and asked what happened, how she knew what to do. She looked at Jace, then at her own shaking hands, and said she did not know. She just remembered what mattered. Breathe, act, survive. Jace leaned back, closing his eyes for the first time since the fall, his breath slow, his body aching. But inside him something lit a small fire, not of pride, but of hope. Someone had learned, someone had acted, someone had chosen the pain and pushed through it. The instructors filed reports. The ethics board watched the recordings again, this time not with fear, but with hesitation. They saw not chaos but control, not recklessness but results. And as Sareth reviewed the footage, his jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something colder. Realization. The methods they feared were not just effective, they were spreading, changing not just bodies, but minds, and minds were harder to control than wounds. Vera did not return to her dorm that night. Instead, she stayed in the medbay, sitting beside the student. She helped save her arm, bandaged her hair, tangled, her eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of the patient's chest. She knew she had crossed something within herself, something that would never return to what it was before, and she was not afraid of it anymore. She was only. Snow began falling again across the ice plains of Severin, soft at first, then heavier with each passing hour. The shuttle took off, leaving behind the crevice, now sealed by frost and marked with a warning beacon. Back at the academy, the returning students were greeted with applause from some and silence from others. The story had already traveled through every hall and channel, whispers of how Jace, the Death Worlder, and Vera, the once timid student, had saved 3 lives using nothing but raw grit and pain forged knowledge. The instructors held emergency meetings. The ethics board delayed judgment, unsure now whether to silence or study what had happened. Edges sat in the academy medbay, his knuckles bruised and wrapped, his knees scraped, his breath still slow from the icy burn of the glacier. Vera sat across from him, holding a cup of thick broth, her fingers trembling from fatigue, but her gaze steady. She said nothing for a long time, then whispered that she no longer feared blood, and Jace finally smiled, just a little, but enough that it reached his eyes. The next morning, an urgent message arrived. All xenobiology cadets were to report to the auditorium for a full debrief. The hall buzzed with nervous chatter as students took their seats. Instructors lined the walls, silent and grim. Then the central screen lit up, showing real-time footage of an unfolding crisis. A shuttle carrying a supply team had crashed on the far side of the glacier. Moon rescue would take time. Conditions were too hostile for immediate recovery. And worse, one of the crew members was critically injured. Velok turned to the students, his voice low. The academy was authorizing a controlled response team formed of students who had already proven field readiness. Medical drones would accompany, but command of triage and emergency stabilization would fall to the lead cadet. His eyes settled on Jace, and the room fell into stunned quiet. Jace simply nodded, rising from his seat without hesitation. But what no one expected was the next moment when Vera stood too and said she would assist within 1 hour. They were back in the sky, the new shuttle cutting through turbulent winds, frost lashing against the hull. The crash site was worse than expected. The shuttle had slammed into a jagged rock field, half buried in snow. Smoke poured from the engines, and one crew member lay trapped inside. The other had managed to crawl clear, but was unconscious with signs of concussion and frostbite. The med drone circled, but could not stabilize the trapped one without risk of rupture or cardiac failure. Jace acted instantly, checking the structural integrity of the wreck. His hands moved across the surface, knocking, listening, measuring the stress points. He barked instructions to the bots to bring specific tools, then pulled out a compact thermal cutter from his belt. Vera moved to the injured man outside, checking his vitals, wrapping thermal bands around his limbs, feeding oxygen into his suit. She paused only once when she saw the blood frozen into his collar, but then she leaned closer, whispering steady breaths just like she had been taught inside the wreck. The heat was rising as flames spread slowly toward the cockpit. The pilot groaned, legs crushed under metal and glass, his breath shallow. Jace reached him, pulling debris with bare hands, fingers torn metal digging into his arms. He ignored the pain. Every second mattered. He reached under the console and wedged a pry rod, lifting slowly enough to avoid spinal damage. The med drone guided him with red beam markers showing bone stress limits. He followed them precisely, his heart pounding louder than the wind. Outside, Vera saw the flames inside intensify. She shouted to Jace, but he did not respond. Then the door burst open, and he came out, dragging the injured pilot across the snow. The medbots rushed in, scanning, stabilizing, flooding the body with cryofoam to prevent blood loss. Jace collapsed to one knee, his vision spinning, but he smiled through the burn because the man was breathing, because he had made it in time. Vera rushed to his side, supporting him, lifting him into the shuttle. The medbots took over, but neither she nor Jace moved from the rear of the bay. They watched the frozen world fade behind them as the shuttle ascended, silence between them, full of everything. They had survived everything. They had become the Academy had sent them as students, but now they were something more, something not yet named, in alien language, but felt deeply in every glance they received upon return. Academy leadership gathered in full for the first time in years. The ethics board, joined by galactic observers, instructors, med chiefs, and even off-world delegates. They reviewed every moment of the mission, every action taken by Jace and Vera. The chairman, a crystalline being with skin that shimmered with thought, asked one final question: what price are we willing to pay for safety when boldness can save lives? No one answered at first. Then Kelm stepped forward and said in a voice clear as frost, "We should study, not silence. We should learn, not fear. And if pain must be part of survival, then let us teach it with wisdom and purpose." The council murmured in agreement, slowly at first, but then with rising unity. That night, Vera stood on the balcony outside her dorm, the stars above blazing like frozen fire. She held her hand out to the wind, no longer flinching. At the cold behind her, Jace approached quietly, asking if she still wanted to learn. She turned and nodded, and he handed her a new manual, blank pages waiting to be filled, not with theory, but with lessons earned by blood and choice and the will to move when others would not. The Academy halls had changed. The silence that once followed Jace had turned into subtle nods, quiet greetings, even hesitant respect. Where once alien students stared with fear, they now whispered about his tactics with wonder. They spoke of Vera, too, once known for her soft voice and shaking hands, now seen as the one who stood in fire and did not run. Instructors rewrote parts of their lessons to include Deathworlder logic, though not all approved. Many could no longer deny its effectiveness. In one corner of the Academy, the lecture dome filled with cadets from multiple disciplines, not just xenobiology but planetary rescue, starship engineering, exomedical training. Jace stood at the center, not on a podium, but at a table spread with broken tools, used gear scraps of metal, torn cloth, sealant tubes, strange objects, all part of what he called real field aid. He asked the students, What they would do if their medical drone failed, if the oxygen ran out, if the injured were too heavy to carry, if fear paralyzed their team. He told them no machine would save you if your own hands refused to move. Vera sat nearby watching as Jace demonstrated the same burns cuts and methods that once horrified them. Now he showed how to tie a knot with frozen fingers, how to keep someone alive using nothing but heat, battery foam, and faith and pressure. She stepped forward and helped apply mock injuries to a volunteer cadet, explaining what each action meant, when to act, how hard to press, and how to read the silence of someone too weak to speak. The students watched with wide eyes. They took notes. They asked questions, some even winced at the techniques, but no one left the room outside the lecture dome. A group of instructors reviewed the footage. One of them, a once vocal critic of Jace, rubbed his chin and admitted that the results were undeniable. Another said they could not argue with survival, even if the method lacked polish. But deep in the administrative level, Sareth sat alone watching older recordings of the first incident in the lab, the cauterized wound, the shattered bone, the way Jace moved with brutal certainty. He paused the footage not with anger this time, but with quiet recognition. He sent a message to the board that night, requesting one final review. In the days that followed, the Academy prepared for an event unlike any before, a live demonstration open to all branches of study, a simulated disaster. Based on real events, curated by Jace and approved by the ethics board. Multiple environments, an underground chamber, split into zones, fire, ice, vacuum, collapse, each with volunteers trained to mimic wounded cadets. Jace would lead one team, Vera another. The goal was not speed, but survival and decision under pressure, not just to act, but to teach others how to act. When the day arrived, the chamber buzzed with observers from over 20 systems. Even off-world leaders tuned in through broadcast drones. Lights dimmed, alarms sounded. The simulation began in the ice zone. Jace led his team through blinding frost. They slipped, they fell. One volunteer screamed with a dislocated joint. Another shivered uncontrollably. He guided his team to strip down insulation and build a heat trap using field lights. Their hands cracked from cold, but they moved fast and with purpose. In the collapse zone, Vera faced a tunnel blocked by debris. With 2 injured volunteers on the other side, she used memory, not just theory, stacking pieces by balance, not strength, and created a passage in under 4 minutes. Then taught her team to carry the wounded using sling pulls they made from their own belts. Observers watched in silence. Instructors leaned forward. The ethics board members showed no expression, but took detailed notes when the final alarm sounded and all zones cleared. Jace and Vera stood with their teams, every volunteer alive, no aid from bots, no instructor interference, just raw training. Fear turned into knowledge and willpower shaped into action. The lead medic bot announced that if the injuries were real, the survival rate would have exceeded most current standard drills by 40%. The room filled with whispers, nods, even scattered applause, but neither Jace nor Vera smiled. They simply looked at each other, knowing the real test would always be the one they never saw coming later. That evening, the ethics board gathered in full. The chairman addressed the Academy through a secure broadcast, stating that the actions of Cadet Jace and Cadet Vera had led to the proposal and creation of a new branch of training within the interstellar survival doctrine, Death Worlder Response Tactics, a field based on immediate decision improvisation under duress and high-tolerance field medicine. For now it would remain elective, but based on current feedback and results, it could soon become standard across colonies and remote exploration teams. Jace was offered a title instructor in provisional field systems, the first human to ever receive such a position in the Academy's long history. Vera was named assistant coordinator and curriculum contributor, both accepted without ceremony, just a quiet handshake and a shared glance of things to come. That night they sat beneath the stars once more, the Academy lights behind them, the sky wide open above. Vera asked Jace what he thought would come next. He said probably pain, probably danger, maybe even loss. But also students who would no longer freeze, who would act, who would save lives, because they were willing to hurt a little to keep Someone breathing, she nodded quietly, and for the first time Jace looked at the stars, not with the gaze of someone who had seen too much pain, but with the calm of someone who knew why he kept walking into it. The academy doors opened wide for the first interstellar survival exchange program, and cadets from across the galaxy stepped through dressed in colors that marked their species, their colonies, their hopes and fears. Many had only read about humans in their archives. Some came curious. Some came cautious. A few came angry that a Deathworlder was now part of the official staff, but all of them came willing to learn, and standing at the entrance, waiting for them, was Jace, no longer just a student, now an instructor, his posture still rough, his scars still visible, but his presence now carried weight and meaning. Beside him stood Vera, dressed in the uniform of assistant coordinator, her expression calm but firm, her once trembling hands now steady with experience. The students lined up as they were welcomed and assigned to teams, given schedules, and shown the 3 simulation arenas, each one modeled after Earth's most unforgiving environments. High-altitude freezing tundra and collapsing underground caverns. The lessons would be hard. The tests would be brutal, and the rules were simple. Do not panic, do not wait, act with your heart. As much as with your men. Jace walked among them, correcting posture, fixing how they held tools, demonstrating pressure points with his own bruised hands. Vera followed, showing them how to see beyond panic, how to listen to breath and feel for warmth. When machines failed, one cadet asked why they could not just rely on bots and drones. Jace said, because bots do not cry when you die, and drones do not improvise when someone is screaming. They do what they are told. And that is not enough when survival hangs by a thread. As days passed, the cadets were tested in real conditions, not virtual, not padded. The lessons were sharp and fast. One drill involved a crash scenario with zero visibility, only sound and touch to guide them. Another required crawling through cold mud to reach a pressure point and stop bleeding from a dummy leaking artificial fluid. Every mistake was met not with punishment, but with review and repeat, until muscle memory replaced hesitation and instinct replaced fear. Jace pushed them hard, not because he enjoyed it, but because he knew what failure looked like and what regret felt like when someone did not make it. Vera became a symbol among the alien cadets, especially those who once feared pain. She never raised her voice, never demanded perfection. But when a cadet cried or faltered, she knelt beside them, told her story, and showed her arm where the scar still ran from the glacier. Her pain became a bridge between cultures, and slowly they began to believe that maybe the human way was not just pain, maybe it was truth, maybe it was survival dressed in discomfort, but filled with strength. One day during a blackout drill, an unexpected tremor hit the lower training dome. The tremor was not part of the simulation. A geological fault shifted deep beneath the academy, shaking the walls. Lights flickering, machines shutting down. One of the teams was still inside the artificial cavern zone. A dozen cadets, including 2 from aquatic species, trapped behind a collapse. Jace moved before anyone else could speak, grabbing his kit and running toward the dome. Vera followed, no hesitation, just motion, both of them diving into real danger once again. Inside, dust filled the air, concrete, cracked walls, weeping moisture. The emergency bots were offline. Power had failed, backup systems too weak to penetrate the depth. Jace crawled through a narrow break in the rubble, calling out, listening for voices. A faint echo responded. He yelled for silence, then listened again. Cadet answered weakly. His leg pinned, another had a broken arm. Vera slid in beside him, using body heat to stabilize one, while Jace lifted debris with improvised pulleys, using ropes and bent beams, every movement calculated, every breath shared between urgency and memory. When they finally pulled the last cadet out, the room erupted in gasps. The students watched them, not as instructors, not even as humans, but as something else, something that bled, and still moved, that fell, and still rose. The recovery team arrived too late. The cadets had already been saved, not by bots, not by protocol, but by hands that refused to stop and eyes that saw through dust and blood. Academy released a formal statement days later, citing the incident as proof that Death Worlder tactics were not just effective, they were essential. A new department was announced focused solely on rapid field response, based on human methodologies. Jace was appointed as chief advisor, Vera as lead integration officer. The decision was passed unanimously by the ethics board. Even Sareth admitted publicly that results could not be ignored, and sometimes fear must be faced to find truth. Years later, the training manual for first contact survival included a chapter titled The Human Method, filled with diagrams of pressure wraps, heat traps, bone stabilization, breath control, and mindset shifts. And at the front of that chapter was a photo of Jace and Vera standing in the cold, beneath the stars, wrapped in bruises and hope. And beside it a single quote from Vera: "Pain is not the enemy, it is the signal to act." Story of the human who shocked a generation with rough hands and raw courage did not end in a lab or on a glacier. It lived on in every cadet who stood when it hurt, every alien who chose to learn instead of fear, every soul who reached into the fire not to destroy, but to pull someone out. Academy grounds were quiet under the twin moons, silver light washing over the marble towers and cold steel walkways. A soft breeze moved through the open courtyard, where cadets now trained through the night. They were not like the ones before them. They moved with sharper steps, their eyes carried weight, their hands steady, not because they feared death, but because they had been taught how to walk through it. The legacy of one Death Worlder had reshaped them. From the courageous stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching a group of new cadets work through a timed extraction. Drill. One cadet stumbled, dropping a field wrap. The others rushed to correct the mistake, without shouting, without blame, because now they understood failure was not weakness unless you chose not to rise again. Beside him stood Vera, her arms crossed, her gaze steady, both of them silent. As the night stretched out around them, a chime echoed across the dome, signaling the end of the session. The cadets gathered their gear, saluted, and dispersed into the barracks, leaving the field quiet. Jace walked forward, kneeling down to pick up a tool left behind. He turned it in his hand, the same kind of tool he once used in chaos, now resting quietly in peace. He looked up at the stars, eyes reflecting the distant galaxies he once thought would never understand him. Vera stepped beside him, asking if he believed they were ready. He said they would never be ready in the way books described, but they were better than before, and that was enough. She nodded, understanding that strength was not a gift, it was a decision made again and again, even when the heart was tired, even when the body begged to stop. Far above them, on the Academy's central tower, a new banner was raised. It held no flag of Earth, no emblem of power, only a single image: two hands, one alien, one human, pressed together over a wound, healing not by magic or machine, but by will and grit and sacrifice. The banner waved quietly in the wind, as if breathing with those below. Across the galaxy, reports arrived from outposts. Rescue teams using Death Worlder tactics, saving miners lost in ice storms, explorers wounded on unknown planets, children trapped in colony collapses, and in each case, someone moved without waiting, someone acted with trembling hands, but a steady heart. And in those reports, one name kept appearing, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in full, not just Jace, but those he had trained, those who had trained others. A chain of action sparked from one lab. One explosion, one choice to act when standing still meant watching someone fade. The ripple had become a wave, a quiet revolution, not of violence, but of purpose. Jace returned to his quarters that night, placing the old manual on his shelf, beside a growing stack of new ones, all written by different hands but born from the same fire. He sat down quietly. Vera entered, carrying a datapad filled with names, requests for more instructors, more courses, more places, asking for help, not from bots, but from those willing to carry pain in their fingers and still keep going. She asked if he was tired. He nodded, but not from teaching, not from running, just from the knowing that pain never ended, but it could be used, shaped, turned into something that saved instead of destroyed. She placed the datapad beside him, and together they sat in the silence that needed no words outside. The Academy cadets still trained through the cold, the wind biting their skin, the drills hard, the simulations merciless, but no one asked, Why anymore they knew, because someone once chose not to wait. Someone once chose to bleed instead of lose. Someone showed them that survival was not a formula, but a fire, and that fire had a name: the end.